I spent my 10-year savings to rebuild my parents' house. At the housewarming party, sister said, "Your role is over. Get out of the house." My parents laughed and said they would disown me. When I took out a certain deed and said, "I want to be able to repay my parents for their kindness." The reason I began to think this way was due to the efforts and love I felt from my parents during my childhood. Despite not being wealthy, they managed to find the money for my education and worked hard to support my future. In response, I made every effort, and after graduating from high school, I aimed for a private university, but there were financial constraints. Nevertheless, my parents explored scholarships and educational loans to support me. I focused on my studies, aiming for a merit-based scholarship, and at university I was able to reduce the financial burden on my family as a scholarship student, yet my parents still helped with part of the food, rent, and material costs. After progressing to higher education, I balanced my studies with part-time jobs and maintained my grades until graduation. When I received a job offer from a leading foreign company after graduating from university, I felt like I was finally starting to repay my parents for their efforts. The desire to give back to my parents with my own efforts became the driving force for my new life. But my workplace was at a foreign company that was highly competitive, and the pressure to perform was a daily burden. In my first year I made many mistakes, and was often scolded by my boss. Despite this, I continued to work hard, supported by the thought of doing my best for my family. As I became accustomed to the work and found efficient ways to produce results, I gained the trust of my seniors and supervisors. By the time I had been with the company for 5 years, I had been promoted to team leader and was entrusted with projects. Thanks to my efforts, I consistently ranked high in performance evaluations and had opportunities for pay raises and promotions. Over time, I was gradually able to build a comfortable financial cushion by saving diligently for 10 years. One day in 10th year, I suddenly felt a strong desire to show my gratitude to my parents in a tangible way. By that time, my income had stabilized, and my savings were close to the target amount. What I had in mind was a plan to gift my parents a new house. They had lived for a long time in an old single-family home that was falling apart everywhere. I wanted to free them from that daily life and provide a comfortable living environment. My concern was that my younger sister had been causing trouble for our parents. She had been spoiled as the second daughter from a young age, and had grown into an adult who could not stand on her own, living off our parents. Although it was also my parents' choice not to forcibly separate her from them, I still wanted to repay them in some way. So I started researching to find the best house. I looked for properties mainly in the area where my parents had lived for many years, selecting some candidates with good access to public transport, convenient shopping, and close to hospitals. On weekends, I visited real estate agencies, repeated model room visits and viewings, and aimed to find a property that would meet my parents' wishes as much as possible. After selecting several properties as candidates, when I finally found the ideal house, I promptly proceeded with the purchase. The house was south-facing with good sunlight, featuring a spacious living room and a kitchen equipped with the latest facilities. Furthermore, the layout allowed for private spaces for both my father and mother on the second floor, with modifications possible for future caregiving. I was confident that I could provide a living environment that was easy for my parents to use and live in safely. To be honest, equipping it with all these facilities cost considerably more than I had imagined. Although I felt temporarily relieved after paying the down payment, the reality of having to make monthly mortgage repayments inevitably weighed heavily on my life. Nonetheless, even faced with this reality, I felt no regret. Instead, I felt a greater sense of fulfillment that I had been able to reach a moment where my efforts, planned and built up step by step, were finally rewarded. When I told my parents about the purchase of the new house, they were initially surprised and could not believe it. My father, especially, asked repeatedly, "Are you really sure?" while showing an undeniable smile, which I still remember. My mother also looked incredulous, repeatedly gazing at the house's photos and tearfully saying, "I never thought I could live in such a splendid house," and simply said, "Thank you." Seeing my parents truly happy was the best reward for me, and I was once again convinced that this choice was not a mistake. I felt a warmth in my heart as I realized that my efforts had finally reached them in a concrete form. The preparation for the move went smoothly, and their new life started. Every time I saw my parents sitting in the living room of the new house, looking comfortable and happy, I felt happy too. This prompted me to approach my own life with even more positivity. However, the beginning of this hopeful new life gradually came with a sense of discomfort. Initially, I watched my parents live in the new house while steadily continuing to make mortgage repayments. The monthly payments were by no means small, but I encouraged myself by thinking, "This is my way of giving back to them." However, the opportunities to be thanked for my efforts gradually decreased, and it began to feel like an expected duty. As my job became busier, the time I could see my parents decreased. Eventually I heard that my sister was frequently visiting my parents' house. Curious, I called her. Have you been going to mom and dad's house every day recently? What about your apartment? I asked. Then, unexpectedly, she replied. I've moved out of the apartment. I've decided to live with them from now on. What? Why so suddenly? Well, there were various things. Anyway, that's the situation, she said lightly, and I was momentarily at a loss for words. The fact that my sister was also living in the house I had bought for my parents somehow felt off, and a small unease grew within me. After all, I wondered how much she really understood the responsibility I had carried, the inner conflicts that came with it, and the decision I had made solely for our parents' sake. Moreover, the fact that my parents had not informed me in advance about my sister moving into the house also felt unsettling. Even a single word of consultation might have made me feel differently. I mulled over in my head. In that moment, I felt as if my existence was reduced to merely providing money, weighing heavily on my heart. Since my sister started living with my parents, an unsettling restlessness continued in my heart. This is especially true every time my parents told me how naturally my sister had adapted to living in the new house as if she had always lived there. Hearing that, a small discomfort slowly spread in the depths of my heart. It was hard to describe this feeling as either jealousy or anger. It was slightly different from either emotion, a complex sentiment that couldn't be easily put into words. Feeling unable to sort out my feelings, I decided to visit my parents' house the next weekend. Once there, I saw my sister relaxing and watching TV in the living room, and I sat down beside her. Then, seizing the moment, I decided to voice the question that had been lingering in my mind. Hey, why did you move out of your apartment? Did mom and dad say something to you? My sister answered nonchalantly with a slight smile. Because I was having a tough time with money, mom and dad said I could live here, and I thought you would naturally agree. At that moment, the small discomfort in my chest swelled suddenly and pressed down heavily. It seemed that I had been completely left out of this discussion between my parents and my sister. Her words intensified the discomfort inside me. When I bought this house, it involved considerable effort and sacrifice. I could finally acquire the house after long hours of overtime and working on holidays. Yet, within the family it seemed natural for my sister to live here, a notion I simply could not accept. Why allow my sister to live here without considering me, the investor? It's not that my sister was at fault, she was merely following our parents' words. But to me, this house wasn't just a building, it was the embodiment of my efforts and a symbol of my pride. That's why I felt resistance to sharing it easily even with my sister. Therefore, I decided to ask my parents as well. Mom, I heard Nicole is living here now, but why didn't you tell me anything? When I asked, my mother began to speak with an awkward expression. Because you seemed busy, I thought I shouldn't trouble you with it. These words left me feeling helpless. Busy as I was, I regretted not being involved in this important decision. I also talked to my father. It's natural to help each other because we're family, he said clearly. I felt frustrated that I couldn't argue with that. Indeed, maybe it's because we're family that we should support each other. However, it felt like my burdens and feelings as the one supporting them were being overlooked, leaving me dissatisfied. Weeks after my sister and parents started living together, I noticed a gradual change in the atmosphere at home. Despite being often at home, my sister did not help with household chores and was mostly uninvolved. She seemed to be relaxing in her room most of the time and contributed nothing to the household expenses despite having a job. This situation continued with her contributing nothing to the house's expenses, and I couldn't help feeling discontent. The unease inside me only grew. It seemed an uncomfortable feeling had taken root within me. One day, compounded by stress at work, I finally expressed my feelings to my sister. Honestly, have you ever considered how hard I worked to buy that house? I'm still paying the mortgage, yet you contribute nothing to the living expenses and don't even seem to be looking for a new apartment. It feels like my efforts are being ignored, and honestly, it's tough. My sister looked surprised, and after a moment of silence, she spoke in a small voice. I didn't know you felt that way, but buying the house was your decision, and it's hard for everyone, so I was just overwhelmed with my own issues. Hearing this, I realized why I had exploded with emotion. I wanted my sister to understand the thoughts and efforts I had put into that house and to acknowledge them. Through this incident with my sister and parents, I deeply felt the importance of boundaries in family relationships. Just because we are family, we should not take sharing everything for granted, but build our relationship while respecting each other's efforts and feelings. I don't know how my relationship with my sister will change in the future. However, by gradually expressing the frustrations I had been holding inside, I might be able to rebuild my relationship with her. But that day marked a turning point in my life. My parents hosted a housewarming party. The fact that I was not invited was the beginning. Had it not been for that event, I might not have experienced such deep pain and loneliness, but reality was harsh and merciless. About a month ago, I had heard from my parents that they were planning a housewarming party. At that time, I felt nothing. The house is new, so let's celebrate grandly. they said, and I naturally agreed and planned to adjust my schedule to attend. However, days passed, and I received no information about when it would be held. Having expected to be invited, I started to feel uneasy. About 2 weeks ago, during a long overdue visit home, I noticed something different about the time I spent with my family. My parents, who used to laugh and chat often, now seemed a bit cold. My sister's gaze was sharp, and I continued to ignore it. Even though I felt this discomfort, I thought it might just be my imagination. However, the lack of communication confirmed my suspicions, and I decided to take action. One afternoon, I hesitated, but ultimately decided to go to my parents' house. I didn't call or message them in advance. When I rang the doorbell and entered the house without any prior notice, I found it bustling. My parents and sister were busy preparing decorations and arranging catering. I approached my sister who was nearby. "What are you doing? What does it look like?" "We're preparing for the housewarming party. The guests will arrive soon," she replied. I was stunned and managed to say, "I didn't get any notification." She responded coldly, "We didn't send one. Do we need to invite you? Your role is over." I was speechless at her ruthlessness, and a chilling sensation enveloped my heart. Instinctively I asked, "What?" But my sister's eyes were looking somewhere far away. My parents were looking in my direction. Both spoke to me with indifferent expressions, without lifting their faces. "We've raised you and paid your university tuition, so this is the least you can do," they said. Those words spread an indescribable chill through my heart. It was as if they were saying I was no longer needed. "Then," my sister coldly declared, "your role is finished. Get out of the house." Her words echoed in my ears and pierced my heart. The cold expression on my sister's face and her words seemed meaningless, or was it just me who felt that way? My parents too were there laughing and saying nothing. I couldn't suppress the rising anger and sadness inside me. The frustration of having spent 10 years working hard and making sacrifices for my family only to be treated as if it were all meaningless, was indescribable. However, I did not show my feelings outwardly. At that moment, a decision formed in my heart. I had come this far without letting my family know that I was the owner of the house, but there was no reason to remain silent any longer. Right then, I took out the deed to the house and presented it in front of them. "I am the owner of this house, and I have no intention of changing that. I've been paying all the mortgage for this house. You've been living here because I allowed it," I declared firmly. The faces of my parents and sister contorted. My sister tried to argue, but I cut her off. "If you intend to kick me out, it's simple. You are the ones who will leave this house." They looked at me incredulously, but I continued without flinching, expressing my determination. "If you want to continue living here, you should have at least shown some gratitude, but that chance is gone. I will no longer be your sacrifice." Afterward, I formally notified them through a lawyer that they had to vacate the house, and I gave them a grace period to leave. Naturally, my parents and sister begged and yelled various emotions at me, but I did not change my mind. I reminded myself that this was a necessary step for me to move forward in life. Eventually, they had no choice but to leave the house. After they were evicted, my sister went around to our relatives' houses, spewing complaints and insults about me. She suddenly kicked us out of the house. She repeatedly claimed, portraying themselves as unfairly treated. However, our relatives gradually began to realize the truth. The fact that my sister had moved out of her apartment without planning ahead, and that the entire family had been taking it for granted to rely on me came to light. Additionally, it became known that I had taken on a decade's worth of effort and a substantial mortgage to buy the house and support the family's lifestyle. The inconsistency between my sister's claims and my actions led the relatives to eventually distrust her story. Some of them even reached out to me to hear my side of the situation. I explained the circumstances of the house purchase and the attitudes of my parents and sister calmly and without emotion. As a result, the relatives agreed with my stance and were critical of my parents and sister for depending on me excessively and lacking gratitude. My sister's actions resulted in the family becoming isolated, a consequence of these facts becoming known to others. As I severed ties with my family, they became isolated from our relatives as well. Following this, my parents and sister found themselves in severe financial difficulty. At first, my mother struggled with managing living expenses and sought help from relatives. However, the response they got was cold, and they were mostly alienated due to their selfish actions. Both my sister and father also received little support from our relatives. My mother repeatedly apologized to me in tears, but I did not respond. Since that day, I have blocked all contact with my parents and sister. The bond that once existed in our family, known for its mutual support among relatives, completely collapsed as a mere result of ruthless actions. Nevertheless, I did not step back, but moved steadily forward to the next step. After stopping the mortgage payments, I immediately contacted professionals and started the process of selling the house. After ensuring there were no legal issues, I assessed the condition and value of the house and prepared it for the market. This decision marks a new beginning for me. I reaffirmed to myself repeatedly, I cannot reclaim the past. However, I understood that I needed to take action for my current self in order to envision a future. The event that would change my life by 180 degrees began with a piece of news I stumbled upon one day. It was a report that the real estate market was unexpectedly booming, and the land value in the area where I had bought my house was rising sharply. When I heard this information, it felt as if a current had run through my mind. Until then, I had never deeply considered the value of the house I owned. It was something I had purchased merely to provide a comfortable living space for my family. A few days later, when I received the appraisal results, I couldn't believe my eyes. The house could be sold for about 10% more than the purchase price. Moreover, due to the high demand for houses in the area, it was possible that the selling price could increase even further depending on the conditions. This news filled me with hope that the difficult days I had endured were beginning to fade. I didn't hesitate to decide to sell, and I swiftly began the preparations. There was a mountain of tasks to be done: organizing documents, inspecting the house, negotiating with real estate agents, but my hands moved quickly through all the tasks. Weeks passed, and the day to complete the sale of the house arrived. That morning I held the documents in my hand and quietly left the house alone. I felt that the person reflected in my family's eyes was no longer the person I used to be. To them, I must have appeared as a heartless person. However, they couldn't understand how deeply their actions had wounded me. I had firmly vowed to act ruthlessly to cut ties with the past and walk towards a new future. The final selling price of the house was about 15% higher than the initial purchase price, a result that exceeded expectations. With that money in hand, I first paid off the long-standing mortgage in full, achieving financial freedom. Meanwhile, I heard from relatives that my parents and sister were still struggling to find a new home. Without substantial funds, it was difficult for them to secure decent residence. My mother began to receive harsh words from relatives and neighbors, such as wasting her daughter's efforts, and losing an important house for their own selfish desires, losing the peaceful days she once had. These criticisms became a severe social pressure unlike anything she had experienced before, eating away at her heart. My sister, somewhat aware that her irresponsible behavior was to blame, remained unable to admit her faults. Moreover, her spending habits hadn't changed, and my parents were at their wits' end. The pensions my parents received were not enough to support even a modest lifestyle, especially with a spendthrift, like my sister, increasing the burden. Unable to stop spending on expensive clothes and hobbies, and with living expenses often falling short, the little savings my parents had gradually began to run out. Even when asked to save, my sister's casual attitude of, "It'll be fine," remained unchanged, further increasing the burden on my parents. Faced with this situation, my parents had to return to work to supplement their living expenses. However, the jobs available to them in their old age were limited, and my mother had to take up unfamiliar part-time work while my father was forced into physically demanding light labor. Despite this, my sister's continued spending meant that the balance between income and expenses was always unstable, making life increasingly difficult. Family relations grew more strained, and my parents, losing their emotional and physical reserves, often argued, while my sister showed no real consideration for the causes. The cumulative burden of her spending eventually depleted my parents' retirement funds, and financial worries became a regular part of their daily lives. The distortions that had been present in the household finally surfaced, but with no way to repair them, the relationship between my parents and my sister only grew more hostile. The stability built through the purchase of the house collapsed, leaving behind only scenes of each pushing heavy responsibilities onto the other. The actions they had once taken against me had indeed come back to haunt them. As I reflected on the time and effort I had dedicated for the sake of my family, I did not look back. I had chosen to live a life for myself at last. In my new residence, I arranged the interior to my liking, creating a comfortable space. While dedicating myself to my work, I enjoyed my hobbies and interactions with new friends in my free time. Now freed from a family that only sought to use me, I had finally attained true freedom and peace.